Okay, great. I'm going to start then. Okay, thank you for that intro, Sam and Anna. I'm going to be talking about how you can deploy your static web app. But before we get to the point of deploying, let's talk about some different concepts, because I think it's important that we have the same language when we try to learn things. So I work for Microsoft daily. I work as a senior cloud developer advocate. You can definitely find me on Twitter. Just like with Sherry, my IMs are open. Okay, you might have heard both of these terms and you maybe thought that they are one and the same. There's actually a difference. So first off, you have the concept called static apps, and then you have the concept called web apps. Now, if you haven't built a lot of static apps, there's no wonder, right? I mean, most of us have built web apps, and with web apps, we mean that we have some kind of framework, could be in JavaScript, .NET, Java, could be anything. What it produces at the end of the day is something that's hosted on a web hotel or in the cloud, and it consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But it also has a backend. And so when this front end talks to this backend, you're able to get what you need in real time. So it always or very often needs to do some kind of interpretation in which it says, hey, backend, what kind of data do I need? Once you get that data, you try to render that. So that's the whole web app concept. Now, a web app can also have static pages, and static pages are pages that never changes. It doesn't have a backend. It's just HTML, it's just CSS, and it's only JavaScript. So a static page will render much, much faster than a dynamic page would. Now, going back here on the left to static apps, they're very easy. They're just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They're very simple and they're very fast to load. So here we have these two different concepts. How do we create them though? Well, looking at the web app, you can be using, for example, on the front end, you could be using React, Angular, Vue, or even Svelte, if you heard of Svelte. Well, as a static app though, has some kind of generator to it. And usually that generator is built on top of an existing SPA framework. And as I said, static apps are very simple beasts in comparison to web apps. So you could be using VuePress and it's built on top of Vue, or you could be using Gatsby, which lies on top of React, or you could be using Scully, which is just released, I believe, and it's on top of Angular. So as you can see, you still have the same kind of foundations, although the end result is a bit different. There's a concept that you need to know about if you are serious about JAMSTACK, or serious about static web apps, I should say, and this concept is called the JAMSTACK. The JAMSTACK is more of a conceptual term. It's not so much a tech stack. It says, hey, we want these apps to be fast, we want them to be pre-rendered, and we want them served off a CDN, a cloud delivery network, a network of computers that has a copy of each of your static apps to make sure that you can meet demands of 100,000 users or 10 users, right? You as a developer shouldn't have to care. The only thing you should care about is the fact that, hey, I want a very simple tech stack. I want it to be fast and readily usable by any user who browse onto my site. So what you get by this concept is, one, better performance. You get higher security because you don't have a backend. And you also have lower cost of scaling because using CDNs are usually a lot cheaper than be using a lot of other type of cloud solutions for a backend, for example. And the developer experience is pretty nice as well. Here's the thing though, a static app doesn't need to stay a static app. You could actually enhance it a bit if you wanted to by talking to your own APIs or maybe some third-party API. The whole point of the JAMSTACK is though to make things very, very simple. Let's try to compare what we mean here. So on the left, we have this traditional view what an app would look like. So we have a front end, we have a back end, and we got a database. So typically when a user surfs into a website, they say, hey, I want you to load this /products or /cart route for me, at which point it says, hey, I'm going to go to backend, then I'm going to go to a database, I'm going to fetch that data, and I'm going to massage it through the backend, and eventually it's being delivered to the front end, and it's being rendered as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, if you're lucky, this takes a few milliseconds. If you're in bad luck, it might take 10 seconds, at which point you probably take your computer up and throw it away, right? No? All right. So let's say you have a JAMSTAck instead. Now this one is a bit different. So if we start here at the bottom, we see that we have a pre-rendering phase. And this pre-rendering phase is actually all the logic that takes place inside of a static app. So what you do here at build time is that you build this locally or on the cloud, but you don't serve it yet, right? So you build with the help of database data, maybe JSON, maybe YAML, whatever kind of data that you have. You take that through a markup, and the end result is your front end, your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This turns out to be a static app, which you can copy in many, many different copies here at the top in this green cloud. That's probably not Azure because it's green. Point is, the static app is very simple. It's using a CDN to scale, so you have many, many different copies. And I've also laid out how you could be using different APIs to enhance it if you wanted to, because you can still do fetch calls from JavaScript, right, and bring in some more data. So that's the two different traditional apps and their workflow when it kind of comes to fetching information and show this to you as a user. How do I deploy a JAMStack? Well, that's a good question, right? I mean, a JAMStack seems like a very simple beast. It's HTML, JavaScript, CSS. What if I have an API? What if it's someone else's API? Well, if it's someone else's API, I don't need to care about that deployment process. But if it's actually my API, then maybe I should build and deploy that at the same time as my static app. And I also, because, well, I'm on the web, I need to be using something called fallback routes. And a fallback route is simply because a SPA application normally, it kidnaps the URL in a way that if you try to refresh it immediately, it breaks. So what you tend to do with a fallback route is to lead it back into index.html and say, hey, this is where you start, and whatever sub route that you're trying to go to, /products or /cart, I know what to do with this because I'm a SPA application. The only thing you need to do here is to configure this fallback route in which you say, hey, lead everything back to this one point. It's good to talk about authentication when it comes to these apps as well, because you can have that as well. And let's also discuss the different steps that you need to deploy. In some cases, you might need to pre-build it locally, and in some cases, you don't actually need to do that pre-step. So there is Azure Static Web App Service. This is a service that was released recently, I believe it was in May, from Microsoft, and it offers you hosting. It's on a free tier, by the way, so definitely try this out if you can. It has an integrated API, which means if you want to add some kind of API to your application, you can do so using Azure Functions. And it also integrates nicely with GitHub. What it actually ends up creating as it's deploying your app are GitHub actions, if you've tried those. And it uses those actions to build and to deploy your app. And then it's globally distributing your app in many different copies, as I was saying, to make sure that it can meet the demands of many, many users. There's also free SSL certificates, and you can customize your own domain to be used with your app. And something I'm very excited about is the authentication. You actually have built-in integration with Azure AD, with Facebook, Google, GitHub, and Twitter. That's nice, right? I can't really hear you back, but it's 2020, so. Okay, so as I said, we have backend routing rules. So here we can really decide what parts of an application can be logged into and which parts, needs to be logged into versus other parts where you don't need to be logged in or you don't need to be an admin. So you can really control different routes dependent on different roles. So I'm going to show how to do that as well. Let's dive into a demo, right? Because we don't really believe all of this sales pitch until we've actually seen something. If we start here, this is a page. Am I using the wrong? Yeah, sorry. Very sorry about this. Let me fix this really soon because I was using the wrong slide deck, the one without videos. Give me just 1 second and we're in business again. We will need this one. Aha. Okay then, we're back. So What we want to do here is to try to deploy an app. We are inside of Azure Portal. If you ever used Azure, this is where you probably spend a lot of time. If you haven't seen Azure before, this is your landing page, if you will. And from here, you can select different services that you would like to use. We're going to put this in business and going to start rolling. So the first thing I'm doing is to enter the name of this Azure service, the Static Web App. It is in preview, as this one is saying, which means it's not quite there yet when it comes to enterprise grade support, but we definitely want you to try this out. It's in a free tier, it won't cost you anything. So what we need to select here in this guide is the subscription. We need to select a resource group, which is kind of a logical bucket where you can place X number of resources that belongs together. And you also need to give it a name and what region in the world where you want this app to live. And the SKU is really the cost scheme that you select for your app. More on that later as this app is going from preview into actual enterprise grade. Now, I'm being taken to a place where I first select my subscription. Then I'm selecting this logical bucket where I want to group all of my things that go together. So here I'm giving it a new name for resource group because I want to create a new one. Can be really inventive with the name, right? Chris Jam. So next I go for a name of my application. And this needs to be globally unique. Apparently there are not that many Chris's on Azure, which is, well, interesting. There are too many Scots anyway, right? Internal Microsoft joke. Okay, so here's the source control. We have an organization. This is GitHub, all GitHub. Select organization. I select repository, which is what I want to deploy from. So that's all it requires from you, the repository and the branch that you want to build from. So this could easily be the master branch, or if you call it the default, depending on how you want to name your branches. Just quickly pause here. Looking at this, we can see the app. The app. We have the API. A3. We got some artifact. So what these things are is that the app location is where your front-end app lives. All right. So let's imagine that your front-end application lives in a subdirectory in your repo. You would need to go and say, hey, /frontend. But now it lives in the default place. Next, the API location. If you do have an API, this will default to be called API. So if you call this API something else like X and Y, you would need to change this. And if you don't have an API, it will just ignore this. Lastly, the app artifact location. This is where your dist files end up. So this is really a way of saying, hey, depending on if I'm trying to build a React app, an Angular app, or maybe a Gatsby app, this sub-directory would be called differently. In most places, I believe it's called build, but let's move on. So I don't change anything here. It's in the default place. I don't change the API. I don't have one yet. And the only thing I need to fill in at this point is the app artifact location, which is, as I said, this is very SPA framework dependent what this one is being called. I believe you can also configure this depending on what system you're on. So if you're on React, you can change it from build to something else. I do review and create at this point just to make sure that Azure analyzes all the selections I've made. Once I'm there, then I can actually hit create. And we're gonna go further here a little bit in the video. And it's, as you see here at the top right, is saying submit deployment. I end up firstly with this kind of deployment name before everything has deployed fully. Just working on it. Let's see if we can boost this up a little bit. All right, so now we've actually come to a point where our resource exists on Azure. It's telling us on the top right here, it's telling us this is the URL. As I said before, you can definitely change this to a custom domain. We also have another piece of interesting information, which is the workflow file on the bottom right. So the workflow file is a file that it adds to your repo, which contains all the build and deployment command, and you can change this after the fact. More on that later. And yeah, it tells you a lot of interesting information about your resource, such as that I deployed this in US, which doesn't make any sense as I'm based in London, but I'm only doing this for the sake of testing. So here a quick look on the workflow file. This has all been created for you. So if you want to change when it triggers, you can do so. So here it's triggering on the master branch. It's also triggering depending on what I'm doing, if I'm merging or if I have a PR and so on. We're just going to take a very quick look at this and zoom in on this later. I want to show you the different actions that it also ends up creating when I'm connecting my GitHub repo to Azure Static Web Apps. So what it does here is to try to first pull down all the Docker containers that it needs for this. This is not something that you need to care about, but it runs the build and deploy. So once it has all the Docker containers, it's going to try to run through the workflow file. And once it does that, it tries to build everything. And the last step it does is to deploy. It's finished uploading at this point. I'm going to move this a bit forward. Nothing is more fun than watching a log file, right? A little bit more. Okay, so now we can see that it's actually done. It has said that visit your site at Mango Wave, and you should be able to see this for real. And a few more seconds. Let's see. And we're clicking our link here, right? So now we're switching to browser, and we can see what the finished deployed version of this looks like. So we have a home route, and we also have a product route that we are going to end up clicking. There we go. And we can see that this is static data. Static data is horribly boring, right? I'm going to show you how to add an API to this next. But first, a few other slides. Just to recap, the URL here on the top right and the resource, this is the URL for your static app. The workflow file, this is being generated for you, but you can definitely go in after the fact and change this if you're not happy with your initial selections. Another look at the workflow file, it contains this if logic here in the beginning, and this is just simply saying when should I trigger. The second point here is to say build and deploy, and this is an action that it defines for you, and it makes sure to handle all the different secrets it might possibly have. And here at the bottom right, you can see app location, API location, and app artifact location. And this is all your UI selections. If you don't like those, you can change those. And here on the top left, we can see that the file is being added to our repo. So that's great. As soon as we connect it to Azure, we see that it ends up in the repo for future deployments. Speaking of API, right? I mean, I said that this was all static data. Static data is boring, so we want an actual serverless API added to this. So we're going to keep on playing this video. At this point, we have generated a function app already, and this is the solution that you go with on Azure to do anything serverless. And we like serverless. Serverless is very cheap. You only pay for when it's actually being executed. So this is great for startups or if you got a hobby project and so on. What I have generated here is a function app with one route called /products. Ooh, a bit quick here. Sorry about that. See if we can show this again. Oop. Too fast. Okay, so now we're looking at what this route looks like, the /products. Looking at it here, we see that it has a static products array. And secondly, on line 13 and below, we are defining a response object in which we say our body should be our products array. So even though this is also a bit simple compared to static data, what we are showing is the fact that we can easily move our logic from the front end to a backend, and the backend in this case is a API. Now the host JSON, the local settings JSON, what we need to do to run this locally is to give it an instruction, because by default, this is going to be protected from being called in the browser. And this is because of CORS, the whole handshaking to make sure that you're on the same domain. Because I'm going to run the backend on one port and the front end on another. Thereby, CORS is going to be activated and say, hey, you can't actually call me. So what I'm doing, only locally, is to say that anything that happens locally, it's okay to talk to the API. So I add this entry into local settings JSON. This is just for the serverless. And once I've done so, I'm free to build and run this. So which is exactly what I'm doing. But don't forget this entry. this is not going to follow us into production because this is local settings JSON, right? Right, now we have built and we run it, and we can see that it's running on port 7071/products. Now we are back inside of our React application. So our React application has a similar behavior. It's not so much CORS, but what it's saying is I need to establish a proxy in my React app. So what I'm doing here is to point out my function app. It runs locally on port 7071, and I'm simply saying, if you from the React app is trying to go towards /API, this is where you actually go. Great. Okay, so I had this entry in package JSON. Create React app knows how to interpret that, and here I have my static data. Right, so this is just one product. So we take that away, and we disable these comments, and now we have what? We have a fetch that goes towards /API. And remember our proxy entry, this will actually go to the function app instead and fetch everything. And we also want to remove the console log statements, just clear them out. And now we actually have a connection between the front end and the back end. So at this point, we can actually try to run our application locally and make sure that this is all good. So we run the start command. This takes a little bit. And now we can see if we go to our home, still just displays home. And for products, it actually displays data now from the API. Cool, right? And now we've actually prepped enough, because we have an API, to commit this to our GitHub repo and just push it. So once we push this, this will trigger our GitHub actions once again. Once those are triggered, they're going to end up redeploying everything. So we have pushed to the repo, and we got a job here in progress, and it just needs to run through our workflow file. Let's skip this a little bit. So here you can see that it's pulling all the Docker containers. Again, this is not something you need to care about. This is internal, how this works. Skip this a little bit till it becomes interesting. Okay, so deployment complete here. So that was roughly a couple of minutes that I skipped. It has run through the workflow file. It now knows about an API because we have a subdirectory called API with a function app in it. And we can actually go towards our browser and our React app. It's the Mango Wave URL, right? We have home, and we also have the products route, which is now serving data from our API instead. So instead of one entry, we have two entries. What happened here? Did we break the app? Well, here's the thing. This is what I've been talking about, right? This is the lack of fallback route, which means that it simply tries to resolve this like this was a static file. So it doesn't really know what to do with this. But there are good news. There are definitely things we can do to fix this. So if we go back into our React application, we have this routes JSON. Inside the routes JSON, we have this entry, and this entry is simply saying, hey, for all routes that you try to attempt, lead those into index.html. And on index.html, we have our React application, and React knows what to do with routes that looks like that, like /products or /cart. So this is the only thing we do, right? This is a redirect. So we have this entry. We just need to make sure that routes JSON is part of our built bundle. So we need somehow to instruct the React project, hey, you actually need to copy this to the bundle. So we take this little bit here, we copy the routes JSON into our build directory, and we just add it to our build command, like so. And then we rebuild locally. We don't really need to do this for deployment's sake. We just want to make sure that this works locally. Okay, we can find routes JSON right under our build directory. This works locally. We have every belief in that it will work remotely as well. Again, we try to commit this, and now with our routes JSON change. Okay, so we add a fallback route, and we push this towards our GitHub repo. And we should be heading back into GitHub, and our GitHub actions should be running again. They're queued up, they're running. I think we can fast forward this a little bit. All right, so poodling Docker containers, we've seen that a few times. What else? Okay, it's working on the other things in the workflow file. Okay. Let's see. It's great that you can scroll this, right? Not like reality. So here you can see that it says finished uploads. It's pretty much done at this point, especially when you got this green text here at the bottom, and it tells us to visit our site, which is really good news. This means that it has actually redeployed everything. We need to pull up a browser at this point. We're just checking that the job is complete, and we should go here, and we should reload this site now with /products. Lo and behold, it's actually working now, right? We can go to products and it still works after refresh, which is exactly what the fallback route should be doing. This is great. It's super how everything works when you got a recorded video, right? Let's look at another bit that this service also offers you, which is authentication. And this is not only login, but also authorization. So you get that bit for free as well. There are some steps that you need to take to make sure that you can utilize the auth functionality. One such step is that you, as a developer of the program, you need to generate an invite. And what you do when you generate an invite is simply to select a few things. So you select a provider, you select a username and email address, depending on what. You select some kind of domain. That's either the pre-created domain that we saw here, the Mango something, or the custom domain that you have, of course, bought, some kind of .dev domain. Am I right? No? Okay, so you also need to be adding different roles, such as admin, a user, or whatever kind of roles that make sense to you and your application. And you need to enter some kind of validity in hours, because you don't want this invitation to be valid forever, right? That would be bad from a security standpoint. And lastly, you generate the link. Okay, then you've done your bit. You've generated a link. Now what? Well, you can send this through email, or you can copy paste this into Slack, and you need to send it to a user that you want to be part of this application. So once the user click this link, they will actually be sent to the login page of the selected provider. What does that mean? Well, a provider, as I said, could be Azure AD. If you look here at the top right, it could be GitHub, could be Facebook, Twitter, or even Google. So once you've selected a provider, you fill in all the other credentials, such as email address or a username if you go with GitHub. You select the domain, you select the roles, comma separated, that you want this user to have, like admin and maybe a normal user. And you enter some kind of invitation here in hours. So once you've done all that, you have your invite, you've sent it. Okay, great. What else do I need to know as an app developer? Well, you should be providing some kind of link. And quick look here at the top left, you see that the routes are .auth. And this is kind of a reserved route, subroute that you shouldn't mess with. So this is used for the authentication functionality only, right? So here you got /auth/login/provider. In this case, we've selected the GitHub provider, but if this was Facebook, this entry should say Facebook instead. In the routes.json, you need to be defining these entries to tell the Static Web App Service that, yes, I'm actually using authentication. And I will show you how that's done in a few slides here. You should also be providing some kind of way to log out. So if you have a link somewhere, it should go to auth/logout. And lastly, I know some of you will want the functionality in which the user is sent to their login page. Once they've logged in, you want to send them to maybe some kind of nice dashboard page, right? This is a parameter here at the bottom called post login redirect URI. Once you set that, you can set it to /dashboard, for example, to ensure that they after login are being sent where they should be sent. Okay. You can actually query this auth backend and ask it for a few details if you want to. So here we are inside of our front end part of our application. By using a fetch, you can actually fetch information about the logged in user. So here you're doing a .auth/me, and what you're getting back is a JSON object that contains the identity provider, the user's ID, and also the user roles. So you could programmatically inspect all of this and maybe run some piece of logic based on this. And if you're in the Azure function backend, if you're inside of an API, you can do pretty much the same, in which you ask for a certain header, and then you just need to decode that header so it's readable. I mean, you shouldn't be returning all of this, right? But rather say, hey, once I have the information from the JSON parsed decoded information, then I can run some logic based on that, maybe based on what role they have. I promised I would explain to you how you would need to add entries into routes JSON. This is it. What you need to be adding here is, first on the top left, what we're saying is, hey, we want the /profile page in our application to be protected. And we only want roles of type authenticated to be allowed to see that page. Looking here at the right, you see a more realistic example of how you would configure your application. So you can see we have both protected profile. We have said that to access admin, you need to be an administrator. To access the API admin, you definitely need to be an admin as well. But to go towards customers Contoso, you would need to be both an admin and the customer Contoso group. This could definitely match towards your Azure AD groups. And yeah, halfway through this page here, we see /login, and we can see that we have selected the GitHub provider. Note how the entry after that, the login Twitter, is actually met with a 404, and this is to explicitly say, hey, we're not using any of these other providers. So you see it's quite customizable, and we can definitely lock down different routes and say, this is okay to reach without being logged in, but here you need to be logged in, and here you even need to be admin or even more. This is nearing the end of my talk. So in summary, I've presented you with two different application models, one being the static apps and represented by the JAMSTAck, in which we have a very simple app, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You can definitely deploy those with this service. For example, apps being created by Gatsby. They are secure, they don't have a backend, they are small, and they're very fast to load. So try to make part of your big web application into static pages, because if it is, some pages at least can be served fast. Now, I totally get if not all of your application can be made static. I mean, you might have an e-commerce site, right? And you might have a cart. You don't know what the static data for a cart looks like. It's always going to be dynamic. So if you only make that part dynamic, there's a lot of gain to be made here. And we knew that the web app has a bit of a different life cycle to it, how it fetches and renders data. Lastly, about the Static Web App Service, it can help you deploy both these types of apps. It supports Azure Function as an API. It supports different auth ways, such as Azure AD, social logins, and so on. And some of you who are listening might be .NET developers, and you're like, this is all JavaScript. Why would I care? Well, here's the good news. If you heard of Blazor, there's actually a blog post from my colleague here, Tim Hoyer, who explains how you can actually change the workflow file. So if you launch a Blazor WASM WebAssembly app, it can actually be deployed by Static Web Apps as well. So that's Razor pages and C#. So no more talk that this is only for JavaScript, okay? There are two Learn modules here. The first one is authored by myself. This is about Gatsby and Static Web Apps, and you can reach it on this link. And the second one is authored by John Papa himself. I think he just prefers to be called John, but you know. It's about SPA deployment, and there are 4 different tracks. So you can definitely go and select your path if you're an Angular developer, React developer, Vue, or Svelte developer. And lastly, to understand more about how to set up and configure this authentication or authorization, here's a link here at the bottom for any of you who are interested in that. And yeah, I'm going to hand this over to our excellent panel.